The morning of June 15th, 1814, arrived wrapped in grey clouds that pressed against the windows of the modest bedchamber. Eleanor Ashworth had occupied for the past 2 years, and she lay watching the pale light creep across the ceiling as the clock on the mantel struck 6, knowing that in 5 hours the man she loved would marry another woman. She had not slept, though she had tried, her body restless beneath the thin coverlet, while her mind rehearsed every reason she should not attend the wedding of Frederick Sinclair, Duke of Ravenscroft, and every reason she must. The invitation had come through her aunt, Lady Harriet Ashworth, who had received it only because the Montagues wished to display the breadth of their social connections, and Eleanor understood perfectly well that her presence was neither desired nor expected. She was, after all, merely the poor relation, the 26-year-old spinster daughter of a deceased viscount who had left nothing but debts and a tarnished name, taken in by her aunt not from affection but from the barest obligation of blood and the usefulness of having an unpaid companion to fetch shawls and endure complaints. Eleanor rose from the bed and moved to the window, pressing her fingertips against the cool glass as she watched servants hurrying through the street below, the whole of London already stirring with anticipation for the grandest wedding of the season. She had loved Frederick for 2 years now, since a summer house party at Pemberton, where she had discovered him hiding in the library, just as she was, both of them refugees from the glittering superficiality of society. And in the space of one golden afternoon, she had found in him a kindred spirit, whose quiet intelligence and unexpected warmth had cracked open something in her heart she had thought permanently sealed. But that was before the winter ball 6 months ago, before she had overheard words that had shattered every fragile hope, before she had understood that whatever she had imagined between them existed only in her own foolish mind. Eleanor turned from the window and crossed to the wardrobe, her bare feet silent on the worn carpet, and she stood for a long moment, staring at the gowns hanging within. Her aunt had instructed her to wear the grey muslin, serviceable and invisible, appropriate for a woman of her diminished status attending an event far above her current station, but Eleanor's hand moved past the grey, past the faded blue she had worn to that terrible ball, and closed instead on black silk. The dress had been her mother's, worn during the mourning period after Eleanor's grandmother had died, and the jet buttons caught the weak morning light as Eleanor drew it from the wardrobe. It was beautiful in its severity, elegant in its darkness, and entirely inappropriate for a wedding celebration. She knew what wearing it would mean, knew the whispers it would ignite, and the disapproval it would draw. But as she held the cool fabric against her chest, Eleanor understood that she needed this small act of defiance, this silent declaration that while the world celebrated, she would mourn what might have been and never was, and she would do so with the only dignity left to her. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The Cathedral of St. George in Mayfair rose against the darkening sky like a monument to everything Eleanor could never possess, its spires piercing the heavy clouds that had gathered throughout the morning, as if the heavens themselves understood the weight of this day. And she stood at the base of the stone steps at 10:30, 1 hour before the ceremony that would bind Frederick to another woman forever, feeling the first drops of rain begin to fall against her upturned face. The carriage ride with her aunt had been a torment of sharp glances and sharper silences, Lady Harriet's garish purple gown rustling with disapproval each time she looked at Eleanor's black silk, and when they had finally arrived and her aunt had hissed that she was a disgrace to the family name, Eleanor had simply inclined her head and said nothing, for what was there to say that her dress did not already declare? Around her, 400 of London's finest society members ascended the cathedral steps in a river of pastel silks and mourning coats, their voices carrying snatches of conversation about the grandeur of the Montague fortune and the handsomeness of the Duke, and the spectacular match that would unite two of England's most prestigious families. And not one of them spared a kind glance for the woman in mourning black who climbed alone. She heard the whispers begin before she reached the doors, felt them ripple through the crowd like stones cast into still water, and she kept her chin lifted and her pace steady as the words reached her ears. "There goes the Ashworth girl," someone murmured, "the one whose father left nothing but debts. And can you imagine wearing black to a wedding?" Another voice added with scandalized delight, as if she were attending a funeral rather than a celebration. Eleanor's fingers found the locket at her throat, pressing briefly against the warm metal that held her most precious secret, and she drew strength from its familiar weight as she passed through the great wooden doors into the cathedral's soaring interior. The space was magnificent, she admitted, allowing herself one moment to take in the cascading arrangements of white roses and trailing greenery. The hundreds of candles that flickered in silver candelabras, the ancient stone pillars draped in silk ribbons the color of cream, all of it designed to showcase the wealth and triumph of the Montague family, whose members already occupied the front pews with expressions of barely concealed self-satisfaction. Lady Montague herself turned as Eleanor entered, her eyes narrowing as they traveled from the jet buttons to the black silk skirts, and the older woman leaned toward her companion to whisper something that made them both laugh behind their gloved hands. Eleanor felt the cruelty land against her like a physical blow, but she did not flinch, did not falter, merely made her way down the side aisle to a pew in the back left corner where a stone pillar would partially shield her from view, and she settled onto the hard wooden bench with her hands folded in her lap, steady as the rain that now began to fall more heavily against the stained glass windows, and she prepared herself to witness the end of every dream she had ever dared to hold. In the vestry of St. George's Cathedral, where coloured light fell through ancient stained glass to paint the stone floor in fragments of ruby and gold and sapphire, Frederick Sinclair stood before a mirror and saw a stranger staring back at him, a man dressed in the finest wedding attire London's tailors could produce, yet hollow behind the eyes in a way that 3 sleepless nights had carved into permanence. His fingers moved mechanically to adjust his cravat for the 4th time, though it needed no adjustment. And beside him, Lord Thomas Beaumont watched with the careful attention of a man who had known his friend for 15 years and recognized the signs of a soul in torment. "You look like a man walking to the gallows rather than the altar," Thomas observed quietly, and Frederick's hand stilled on the white silk at his throat, unable to deny the truth of it. The vestry smelled of candle wax and old incense and the particular mustiness of centuries, and Frederick thought of another room that had smelled of leather bindings and summer roses, a library at Pemberton where he had discovered that loneliness was not, in fact, his permanent condition, where a woman with thoughtful grey eyes had looked at him and seen not the Duke, but simply Frederick, grieving and lost, and desperately in need of someone who understood. He touched the signet ring on his finger, his father's ring, and wondered what the old Duke would say if he could see his son now, preparing to marry a woman he did not love because the estates required her fortune, because duty demanded sacrifice, because Frederick had been raised to believe that personal happiness was a luxury men of his position could not afford. Thomas stepped closer and spoke in a voice meant only for Frederick's ears, asking if he was certain this was what he wanted, and Frederick nearly laughed at the absurdity of the question, for want had nothing to do with the choice before him. He wanted Eleanor Ashworth, had wanted her since that golden afternoon 2 years ago when she had challenged his interpretation of Shakespeare's sonnets and made him feel alive for the first time since his father's death. But Eleanor despised him now had fled from him at the winter ball 6 months past and refused every attempt he had made to explain, and so want was irrelevant. The Sinclair estates were drowning in his father's debts, the tenants depending on him for their livelihoods, and Lydia Montague's dowry would save them all. And that was the calculation that had brought him to this vestry, this mirror, this moment of quiet desperation before the performance began. Thomas was speaking again, mentioning the guests assembling in the cathedral, and Frederick heard himself ask the question before he could stop it, his voice rough with something he refused to name, inquiring whether Miss Ashworth's name had appeared on the guest list. Thomas's expression shifted to one of gentle understanding as he confirmed that Lady Harriet Ashworth had been invited and would likely bring her niece, and Frederick closed his eyes against the surge of anguished hope that rose in his chest, knowing that seeing her today would be the cruelest gift imaginable, yet wanting it none the less with a ferocity that terrified him. The library at Pemberton House in August of 1812 smelled of leather bindings and furniture polish, and the particular golden warmth of late summer sunlight streaming through tall windows that had been thrown open to catch whatever breeze might wander in from the gardens. And it was here that Eleanor Ashworth had retreated on the 3rd day of the house party. Seeking refuge from the endless chatter of eligible young ladies discussing their prospects and the watchful eyes of mammas calculating the worth of every unmarried gentleman in attendance. She had lost her father only 4 months prior, the grief still raw beneath her composed exterior, and the effort of pretending to be a suitable candidate for courtship had exhausted her reserves of social grace, driving her to this sanctuary of books and blessed silence where she could simply breathe without performance. She had not expected to find the room already occupied, had not anticipated the tall figure standing at the window with his back to the door, his posture speaking of a weariness that mirrored her own. And when he turned at the sound of her entrance, she found herself meeting the eyes of Frederick Sinclair, the newly minted Duke of Ravenscroft, a man whose reputation for cold reserve had made him the subject of much whispered speculation among the other guests. "I beg your pardon," she had said, already retreating. I did not realize anyone was here, but he had held up a hand and spoken in a voice rough with something that sounded remarkably like relief, asking her, please not to go, confessing that she was the first person in 3 days who had not immediately begun discussing either his fortune or his eligibility. They had talked for hours that afternoon, first about the volume of Shakespeare's sonnets she had been seeking on the shelves, then about grief and the peculiar loneliness of loss. And Eleanor had discovered that beneath the Duke's remote exterior lay a man who had adored his father and found himself drowning in responsibilities he had never expected to inherit so soon. He had listened to her speak of her own father with an attention that felt like sunlight on frozen ground, and when she had confessed that she sometimes felt invisible in company, valued only for what she might bring to a marriage rather than who she was, he had looked at her with those grey eyes and said that he saw her quite clearly, and that what he saw was extraordinary. They had met in the library every afternoon for the remaining 5 days of the party, their conversations ranging from philosophy to favourite childhood memories to their shared love of rainy mornings and quiet contemplation. And on the final day, Frederick had walked with her in the garden and picked a yellow rose from a bush near the fountain, pressing it into her hands with a promise that this would not be their last meeting, that he would call upon her in London when the season resumed. Eleanor had kept that rose, had pressed it carefully between the pages of her own volume of sonnets, and later placed it in the locket that had belonged to her mother, and she had carried it against her heart through every month that followed, through the slow decline of her circumstances and the growing certainty that a duke could never truly choose a woman with nothing to offer but herself. The winter ball at Sinclair House in December of 1813 glittered with the cold brilliance of 1,000 candles reflected in mirrors and crystal, and Eleanor Ashworth stood at the edge of the ballroom in her faded blue gown, the same dress she had worn to 3 previous events that season, because her circumstances no longer permitted the luxury of variety, watching snow fall past the tall windows and trying to quiet the desperate hope that fluttered in her chest at the thought of seeing Frederick again after so many months of silence. He had written to her twice after Pemberton, letters she had kept folded beneath her pillow until the paper grew soft from handling. But then the letters had stopped, and she had heard through whispered gossip that the Sinclair estates were in dire financial trouble, that the new Duke was being pursued by every wealthy family with a marriageable daughter, and she had told herself that his silence meant nothing, that he would explain when they met again, that the connection they had forged in that sunlit library could not simply evaporate like morning mist. She saw him across the ballroom, tall and severe in his black evening clothes, and her heart seized when their eyes met for one brief moment before he turned away to greet Lady Lydia Montague, whose golden beauty and enormous fortune had made her the most sought-after prize of the season. Eleanor watched them dance, watched Lydia laugh up at Frederick with practiced charm, watched Frederick's mother, the Dowager Duchess, observe the pair with obvious approval, and she felt something cold settle in her stomach, even as she reminded herself that a dance meant nothing, that he had promised her a rose and a future, and she must believe in that promise. It was nearly midnight when Eleanor slipped away to find a moment of quiet, and it was pure misfortune that led her to pause outside the partially open door of the Dowager's private sitting room, where she heard Frederick's voice speaking with unusual force. His mother's cold tones cut through first, declaring that the Ashworth girl was unsuitable, a penniless nobody with nothing to recommend her but a tolerable face that would fade soon enough, and Eleanor's blood turned to ice in her veins as she waited for Frederick to respond. She heard him speak then, heard the words that would shatter her entirely, his voice tight as he said that Miss Ashworth was nothing to him, that she could never be anything to him. And Eleanor did not stay to hear more, did not hear him continue, that she could never be anything to him but everything, that her worth exceeded any fortune, that he would not hear his mother speak of her so dismissively. She fled through the snow without her cloak, and by the time Frederick realized she had gone and searched every room of the house for her, Eleanor had vanished into the winter night, taking with her the absolute certainty that she had been a fool to hope, and leaving behind a man who would spend the next 6 months believing she had finally seen him for the cold, duty-bound automaton his mother wished him to be, and despised him for it. The Cathedral of St. George in Mayfair filled steadily as the clock crept toward 11 in the morning, and Eleanor Ashworth sat perfectly still in her place at the back left pew, pressed close to a stone pillar as though she might somehow merge with it and disappear from the sight of the 400 guests who had come to witness the wedding of the season, her black silk dress drawing glance and whispers that spread through the congregation like ripples across dark water. She could feel their eyes upon her, could hear the hiss of scandalized commentary passing from pew to pew, and she kept her own gaze fixed upon the altar where candles flickered in the draught that crept beneath the great doors, refusing to acknowledge the cruelty that surrounded her like a fog. Lady Montague, mother of the radiant bride, had spotted Eleanor within moments of taking her place in the front pew, and her whisper to the woman beside her had been pitched just loudly enough to carry, declaring it an absolute disgrace that certain persons would wear mourning to a wedding, that some people had no concept of propriety, that one could hardly expect better from a girl who had fallen so far from her stationeros. The words landed like small, precise blows against Eleanor's composure, but she had spent 2 years learning to absorb such strikes without flinching, had built her armor of calm through countless similar moments of dismissal and disdain, and she simply folded her hands in her lap and watched the rain begin to fall more heavily against the tall, stained glass windows, the grey light transforming the cathedral into something appropriately sombre for the burial of her hopes. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, warning growl that seemed to echo the turmoil she refused to show on her face, and she thought of the library at Pemberton House, where sunlight had streamed through open windows and a man with grey eyes had told her she was extraordinary. Thought of the winter ball where those same eyes had belonged to a stranger who declared her nothing. Thought of the yellow rose pressed against her heart in its silver locket. And she wondered if she had been mad to come here at all, if this final act of witness was courage, or simply another form of the self-punishment that had become her constant companion. Around her the pews continued to fill with silks and satins and jewels that caught what little light filtered through the storm-darkened windows, and she catalogued the turned heads and raised eyebrows and fans lifted to conceal moving lips, knowing that by evening every drawing-room in London would buzz with the tale of the poor relation who had worn black to the Duke of Ravenscroft's wedding, the desperate spinster making one last pathetic bid for attention. And she found that she did not care, that their judgment had long since lost its power to wound her more deeply than she had already wounded herself. The organ began to play, low notes that resonated through the stone and settled into Eleanor's bones, and she straightened her spine and lifted her chin and prepared to watch the man she loved marry another woman. The great doors at the back of the cathedral opened, and a collective intake of breath swept through the congregation as Lady Lydia Montague appeared in the entrance, a vision in white silk that caught what little light filtered through the storm clouds. The legendary Montague pearls cascading in 3 luminous strands around her throat, and more pearls woven through her golden hair, beneath a veil of Brussels lace that had cost more than Eleanor's father had left her in his entire estate. And Eleanor forced herself to look, to witness, to burn this image into her memory as the final seal upon the tomb of her foolish hopes. But even as she watched the bride begin her triumphant pause at the threshold, she became aware of a sensation like heat upon her skin, a weight of attention that had nothing to do with the whispered condemnations of those around her. And when she lifted her gaze from Lydia's magnificent figure to the altar where Frederick stood waiting, she found his grey eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that stopped her breath in her throat. He was pale as marble in the candlelight. Shadows carved beneath his eyes, speaking of sleepless nights. And he was not looking at his bride at all, but staring across the sea of silk and satin and feathered headdresses directly at Eleanor in her black mourning dress, and something in his expression made her heart lurch painfully against her ribs, something that looked almost like recognition, like understanding, like the same devastation she had carried for 6 months reflected back at her from across an impossible distance. Their gazes held for one endless moment, while the organ swelled and Lydia began her gliding progress down the aisle on her father's arm, and Eleanor could not look away, could not break the connection that stretched between them like a golden thread pulled taut to breaking, could not pretend any longer that she had come here for closure, when the truth was she had come to see him one last time, to breathe the same air, to exist in the same space even if he never knew she was there. But he knew now, and his eyes had not left her face, and Eleanor watched something shift in his expression as he took in her black silk and jet buttons, watched his lips part slightly as though he had been struck, watched his hands curl into fists at his sides, and she realized with dawning horror that he understood what she had not meant to say, that her mourning dress proclaimed her grief as clearly as if she had stood up and declared it to the congregation. Lydia had reached the halfway point of the aisle when she noticed her groom's attention had strayed, and Eleanor saw the bride's radiant smile falter, saw her golden head turn slightly to follow the direction of Frederick's fixed stare, saw those lovely blue eyes narrow with sudden sharp suspicion as they found Eleanor's dark figure pressed against the pillar in the back of the church. The look Lydia gave her lasted only a second, but contained a lifetime of feminine fury, of territorial rage, of the absolute certainty that she had identified an enemy she had thought long since vanquished. And then the bride's smile was back in place, brighter and more determined than before, and she continued her march toward the altar, where Frederick stood watching Eleanor as though she were the only person in the cathedral, as though 400 guests and a bishop and a bride in pearls had all simply ceased to exist. The wedding march swelled through the cathedral as Lydia continued her measured progress down the aisle, each step perfectly timed to the music, each movement calculated to display the magnificent train of white silk that whispered across the ancient stones behind her, and Frederick watched her approach with the strange detachment of a man observing his own execution from some remove, his body present at the altar, while his mind remained fixed upon the woman in black who sat motionless in the back pew, her dark eyes holding his across the sea of turned heads and craning necks, her presence a silent accusation that stripped away every pretense he had constructed over the past 6 months. He understood now what her dress meant, understood it with a clarity that cut through the fog of duty and obligation that had clouded his vision since December, and the knowledge burned through him like fire, like the summer sun that had streamed through the library windows at Pemberton when he had first heard her laugh and felt his carefully guarded heart crack open despite his best efforts to keep it sealed. She was mourning for what they had lost, mourning for the future that should have been theirs, and she had come here in her mother's black silk to bear witness to the death of her hopes with the same quiet dignity that had first drawn him to her, that quality of stillness and depth that made every other woman in the room seem shallow and false by comparison. Thomas shifted beside him, a subtle movement that spoke of concern, and Frederick felt his friend's questioning gaze upon his profile, but could not tear his attention from Eleanor long enough to offer reassurance, could not pretend that everything was proceeding as it should, when every fiber of his being screamed that he was making a catastrophic mistake. Lydia was closer now, near enough that he could see the triumph glittering in her blue eyes, the possessive smile curving her perfect lips, and he thought of the Montague fortune that would save his estates, thought of his mother's satisfaction and society's approval, thought of all the rational reasons he had accepted this match, and found that none of them could stand against the weight of Eleanor's steady gaze from across the cathedral. The candles flickered wildly as thunder rolled overhead and rain lashed against the windows with renewed fury, and Frederick's hands trembled at his sides as Lydia reached the altar at last, as her father placed her gloved fingers into his keeping and stepped back with a satisfied nod, as the bride turned her radiant face up toward him and reached for his hand with the confident expectation of a woman who had never doubted she would get exactly what she wanted. Her grip was too tight, her fingers pressing into his with an urgency that felt less like affection than ownership, and Frederick looked down at the beautiful face beneath the Brussels lace veil, and saw nothing, felt nothing, knew with sudden devastating certainty that he could not spend the rest of his life pretending this emptiness was enough when Eleanor Ashworth sat 50 feet away, wearing her heart's grief for all the world to see. The bishop's voice rose and fell in the ancient cadences of the marriage ceremony, words that had bound countless souls together across centuries of tradition, and Eleanor listened to each syllable as though it were a hammer blow driving the final nails into the coffin of her hopes, her fingers pressed hard against the wooden pew beneath her as she willed herself to remain seated, to witness the completion of this ritual that would sever forever any thread of possibility between herself and the man who stood at the altar with another woman's hands clasped in his own. And she thought that when the vows were spoken, she would slip away quietly through the side door, disappear into the rain, and the anonymous streets of London, where she could finally release the tears she had held back all morning, where she could mourn properly and completely for the death of a love that had never truly lived except in the secret chambers of her heart. The elderly bishop squinted at his prayer book through spectacles that sat crookedly on his nose, his voice carrying the slight tremor of advanced age, and he intoned the familiar question about impediments to the marriage, asking if any person present knew of any reason why these two people should not be joined in holy matrimony, and the cathedral fell into a breathless silence, broken only by the drumming of rain against the windows and the distant rumble of thunder that seemed to echo the turmoil in Eleanor's chest. And she watched Frederick's profile from across the vast space, watched the muscle jumping in his jaw and the rigid set of his shoulders, watched Lydia's gloved fingers tighten around his with an urgency that bordered on desperation. And no one spoke, no one moved, and the moment stretched into eternity before the bishop nodded and continued, apparently satisfied that no objection would be raised. Frederick was asked to repeat his vows, to pledge himself to Lady Lydia Montague for all the days of his life, and Eleanor began to rise from her seat, her movement slow and careful so as not to attract attention, her eyes fixed on the side door that promised escape from this beautiful torture. But she paused halfway to standing when she realized that Frederick had not spoken, that the cathedral had gone unnaturally still, that even the rain seemed to have quieted, as 400 guests held their breath and waited for the Duke of Ravenscroft to claim his bride. Lydia's smile had frozen into something brittle and sharp, her fingers now gripping Frederick's hands so tightly that her knuckles showed white through her silk gloves. And the bishop repeated his prompt with a note of confusion, asking Frederick once more to speak his vows, and still the silence stretched, unbearable and absolute, until Frederick drew a breath that seemed to cost him everything he had ever been taught about duty and honor and obligation to his name. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried clear and steady across the hushed cathedral. 2 words that shattered the stillness like stones thrown through glass. Words that would echo through London, drawing rooms for years to come, and change the course of Eleanor's life forever. And those words were simply this: I cannot. The gasps that rippled through the congregation swelled into a cacophony of shocked whispers and strangled exclamations as Frederick released Lydia's hands and stepped backward from the altar, his movement deliberate and unhurried despite the chaos erupting around him, and he felt the weight of 400 stares pressing against him like a physical force, but could not bring himself to care about any of them, could not spare a single thought for the scandal he was creating or the fury building in Lydia's beautiful face as she stood abandoned in her white silk and Montague pearls, her carefully orchestrated triumph crumbling to ash before the assembled cream of London society. I cannot marry you when I love another, he said, and his voice carried clear and strong across the cathedral, cutting through the rising tumult with the precision of a blade, and he watched comprehension dawn in Lydia's eyes, watched her expression transform from confusion to disbelief, to a rage so pure and incandescent that it seemed to illuminate her from within, and she screamed his name with a fury that echoed off the vaulted ceilings and caused several elderly matrons in the front pews to reach for their smelling salts. Her veil had been knocked askew by the violence of her reaction, hanging crookedly across her face like a shroud for her ruined expectations, and her mother rushed forward with arms outstretched while her father stood frozen in place, his face purpling with an apoplexy that promised dire consequences, but Frederick had already turned away from them all, and his eyes fixed upon the woman in black who stood motionless near the back of the cathedral, her dark eyes wide with shock, and her lips parted as though she had forgotten how to breathe. Thomas stepped forward and placed a steadying hand on Frederick's shoulder, a gesture of support that spoke louder than any words could have, and the bishop sputtered protests about propriety and sacred vows and the impossibility of what was happening, his aged voice cracking with distress. As he clutched his prayer book to his chest like a shield against the madness unfolding before him. Thunder cracked overhead with a violence that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cathedral, and Frederick began walking down the aisle toward Eleanor, his stride lengthening with each step as the guests shrank back from him as though scandal itself were contagious, and he passed through the sea of shocked faces and pointing fingers and scandalized whispers without acknowledging any of them, his entire being focused upon reaching the woman who had haunted his dreams for 2 years, the woman whose quiet dignity and hidden depths had captured his heart in a sunlit library and never released it, the woman who wore black to his wedding because she was mourning for a love she believed lost forever. And he would not rest until he had proven to her that their story was only just beginning, that every sacrifice and scandal was worth the chance to finally speak the truth that had been locked away in his heart since the summer they met at Pemberton. Eleanor stumbled backward as Frederick approached, her mind refusing to accept the reality of what was happening, the impossibility of the Duke of Ravenscroft walking away from his own wedding with 400 witnesses watching in scandalized horror, and she reached for the cold stone pillar behind her to steady herself as the cathedral erupted into chaos around them, voices rising in shocked exclamations and outraged demands, and the piercing wails of Lydia Montague, who had collapsed into her mother's arms like a marionette with severed strings. She turned toward the side door, desperate to escape before Frederick could reach her, before he could speak words that would only deepen the scandal and destroy whatever remained of his reputation. But her feet tangled in the hem of her mother's black dress, and she stumbled, losing precious seconds as he closed the distance between them with long, determined strides that scattered guests like startled birds. "Eleanor," he said, and her name on his lips after 6 months of silence struck her with the force of a physical blow, stopping her retreat as effectively as if he had reached out and grasped her arm. "You must go back," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the tumult of scandalized voices and Lydia's theatrical sobbing and the bishop's increasingly frantic calls for order. "You must fix this before it is too late, before the damage becomes irreparable. I will not be the cause of your ruin." Frederick stopped before her, close enough that she could see the rapid pulse beating in his throat and the intensity burning in his dark eyes. Close enough that the familiar scent of him reached her through the cathedral's incense and candle smoke, and he shook his head with a certainty that brooked no argument. "It was already too late the moment I saw you sitting there in black," he said, his voice steady despite the pandemonium surrounding them, mourning for something you believed was lost, and I realized that I had been the greatest fool in England for letting duty and misunderstanding keep me from the only woman I have ever truly loved. Eleanor's protest died on her lips as he reached for her hand, his fingers warm and strong as they closed around her trembling ones, and she felt the touch resonate through her entire being, like the first chord of a symphony she had believed she would never hear. The crowd pressed toward them, faces twisted with curiosity and judgment and gleeful anticipation of the gossip to come, and somewhere behind Frederick she could hear Lord Thomas calling out encouragement while attempting to hold back the more aggressive onlookers who seemed determined to witness every moment of this unprecedented scandal. Frederick turned toward the great doors at the cathedral's entrance without releasing her hand, and Eleanor found herself drawn along in his wake as he strode toward the grey light and driving rain that awaited them outside. And when the doors swung open to reveal the storm that had been building all morning, she gasped as the cold wind struck her face and the rain immediately began to soak through the black silk of her mother's dress. Frederick's wedding coat was drenched within seconds, the fine fabric clinging to his broad shoulders as he led her down the cathedral steps toward his waiting carriage. And behind them the crowd spilled out onto the portico to watch the Duke of Ravenscroft flee his own wedding with the spinster in black, their shocked murmurs mixing with the thunder that rolled across the London sky. The Sinclair carriage stood waiting at the base of the cathedral steps, its matched black horses stamping nervously in the downpour as a footman rushed to open the door, and Frederick handed Eleanor up into the dim interior without ceremony, his grip on her fingers firm and unyielding, as though he feared she might dissolve into the rain like a dream he had conjured from 6 months of sleepless longing. He climbed in after her and pulled the door shut against the chaos outside, against the crowd that had gathered on the portico to witness the most spectacular scandal London had seen in a generation, and he rapped sharply on the roof to signal the driver before turning to face Eleanor in the grey light that filtered through rain-streaked windows. The carriage lurched into motion as she pressed herself into the corner of the seat, her mother's black silk dress clinging to her trembling frame, water dripping from her hair and pooling on the velvet cushions beneath her. And she stared at Frederick with an expression that mingled disbelief and terror, and something else, something fragile and desperate that she was clearly struggling to suppress. "You have lost your mind," she said, her voice emerging as barely more than a whisper above the drumming of rain on the carriage roof and the rumble of wheels over cobblestones. "You have just destroyed yourself before 400 witnesses, and you are sitting here as though you have done nothing more remarkable than decline an invitation to tea." Frederick leaned forward, close enough that she could see the raindrops caught in his dark hair and the fierce intensity burning in his eyes, and he shook his head slowly. "I have done nothing of the sort," he replied, his voice low and steady, despite the tremor she could see in his hands where they rested on his knees. "I have finally done the only thing that matters, the only thing I should have done 6 months ago when I let pride and misunderstanding drive you away from me." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as the carriage swayed around a corner, carrying them further from the cathedral and the screaming bride and the scandal that would pursue them both for years to come. And she felt the cold seeping through her ruined dress and into her very bones, even as something warm and dangerous began to kindle in her chest. The wedding ring, she noticed suddenly. The gold band that should have been placed on Lydia Montague's finger by now sat untouched in Frederick's waistcoat pocket, a glint of metal visible through the soaked fabric, and the sight of it made the reality of what had just occurred crash over her with renewed force. "Tell me why," she demanded, her composure finally cracking, as tears she had held back all morning began to mix with the rainwater on her cheeks. "Tell me why you would throw away everything for a woman you have not spoken to in half a year. Tell me what possible madness possessed you when you saw me sitting there in black while your bride walked toward you in white and pearls." Frederick reached across the space between them and took both her trembling hands in his grip warm and steady, despite the cold that seeped through their soaked clothing. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 6 months of silence and regret, and sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling of his bedchamber, wondering how everything had gone so terribly wrong. "The winter ball," he began, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You heard me speaking with my mother in the alcove near the ballroom, did you not?" And Eleanor nodded slowly, remembering the cruel words that had shattered her fragile hope and sent her fleeing into the snow without her cloak, without her dignity, without anything but the bitter certainty that she had been a fool to believe a duke could ever truly want a penniless viscount's daughter with nothing to recommend her but a sharp mind and a stubborn heart. "I heard everything," she whispered, her voice raw with remembered pain. "I heard you tell her that I was nobody, that I had nothing to offer, that you could never consider someone like me when there were heiresses lining up for the honor of your attention." Frederick's hands tightened on hers and something fierce and desperate flashed across his features as he shook his head. "You heard my mother's words, not mine," he said, his voice breaking slightly on the confession. "She was demanding that I dismiss you from my thoughts, that I forget whatever attachment had begun to form between us, and I was telling her that I would not, that I could not, that you were worth more to me than any fortune or connection or advantageous match that society could offer." Eleanor stared at him as the carriage swayed around another corner, as the rain continued to drum against the roof like 1,000 urgent fingers demanding entry, and she felt the world she had constructed over the past months begin to crumble around her, the careful walls of resignation and acceptance dissolving like sugar in water. "I searched for you that night," Frederick continued, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on her wrists where her pulse beat rapid and frantic beneath her skin. "I searched every room and every corridor, and when Thomas told me you had fled into the storm, I nearly lost my mind. I sent footmen out looking, but you had vanished, and the next morning your aunt sent word that you were indisposed. And by the time I could call upon you, she had taken you back to the country, and you would not receive my letters." "You wrote to me," Eleanor breathed, and the realization struck her like a physical blow because she had received no letters, had heard nothing from him in all those months except the announcement of his engagement that had appeared in the papers like a death knell for everything she had secretly hoped. "A dozen letters at least," Frederick confirmed, "each one more desperate than the last, each one trying to explain what you had misheard, but they were all returned unopened, and I believed you hated me. I believed you wanted nothing more to do with the man who had seemingly dismissed you before his own mother." "I have loved you since Pemberton," he said, and the words fell between them like stones dropped into still water. "I have loved you for 2 years, and I nearly destroyed both our lives because I could not find a way to make you hear the truth." The carriage rolled to a stop before Sinclair House, and Frederick descended first, turning to offer Eleanor his hand, as the rain continued its relentless assault upon the cobblestones, and the waiting servants stared with barely concealed astonishment at the sight of their master arriving home on his wedding day with a woman who was decidedly not his bride. Her black silk dress clinging to her frame like a second skin, and her hair tumbling from its pins in wet tendrils that framed a face still streaked with tears and rain. Frederick guided her up the steps and into the warmth of the entrance hall, calling for fires to be lit and hot water brought and dry clothes found, his voice carrying the authority of a man who would brook no questions and no hesitation, and the staff scattered to obey while he led Eleanor toward the drawing-room, where a footman was already coaxing flames to life in the marble hearth. It was only when they stood before the fire, steam beginning to rise from their sodden clothing, that Frederick reached out and touched the delicate chain at Eleanor's throat, his fingers brushing against the hollow, where her pulse beat rapid and visible beneath her pale skin. "This locket," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion, as he traced the oval of gold that she had worn every day for 2 years without fail. "You were wearing it at the cathedral. I saw it glinting against the black of your dress, and I need to know what it holds because I have been torturing myself with possibilities since the moment I noticed it." Eleanor's hand rose to cover his, pressing his fingers against the warm metal, and she felt the last of her defenses crumbling as she looked up into his dark eyes and saw nothing there but tenderness and desperate hope, and a love that matched her own in its painful intensity. "It holds a rose," she whispered, "a yellow rose that a man once picked for me in a garden at Pemberton while we discussed Shakespeare's sonnets, and I fell hopelessly in love with someone I believed I could never have." Frederick's breath caught audibly, and his fingers trembled against her skin as he carefully unclasped the locket and opened it to reveal the pressed flower within, its petals faded to a pale amber, but still recognizable, still carrying the faint ghost of summer and possibility. and a connection that had never truly broken, despite all the misunderstandings and months of silence that had followed. "You kept it," he breathed, and the wonder in his voice made fresh tears spring to Eleanor's eyes as she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion that clogged her throat. "I have loved you since that afternoon," she finally managed. "I have loved you through every moment of believing you thought nothing of me, through every sleepless night and every dream of what might have been. And when I chose to wear black to your wedding, it was because I was mourning the death of that hope, even as I could not bring myself to let it go entirely." Frederick cupped her face in both hands, tilting it upward, and when he kissed her, it was tender and desperate, and tasted of rain and tears, and 2 years of longing finally given permission to exist. The hours that followed passed in a haze of warmth and wonder. Eleanor ensconced in the drawing-room before the crackling fire, while servants brought tea and blankets, and carefully averted their eyes from the woman who was most decidedly not the Duchess they had expected to be serving on this day, and she found herself wearing a borrowed dress of simple grey wool that the housekeeper had produced with quiet efficiency. Her ruined black silk taken away to be cleaned, though Eleanor doubted it could ever be salvaged after its baptism in the rain that had witnessed her transformation from mourner to beloved. Frederick had stepped away to change from his own sodden wedding clothes, and Eleanor sat alone for the first time since the cathedral, her hands wrapped around a teacup that trembled slightly as the magnitude of the morning's events began to settle upon her like snow accumulating on winter branches, each flake of realization adding to the weight until she wondered if she might collapse beneath it. She was still sitting thus when the door burst open and Lord Thomas Beaumont strode in, his usually composed features flushed with exertion, and his cravat askew as though he had ridden hard across London to reach them, and behind him came Frederick, now dressed in simple dark coat and trousers, looking more himself than he had in the elaborate wedding attire that had seemed to wear him rather than the reverse. "The news is not good," Thomas announced without preamble, his voice carrying the grim weight of a man delivering battlefield dispatches. "Lady Lydia has taken to her bed with what her mother is calling a nervous collapse, though the servants say she threw a vase at the physician who tried to examine her, and Lord Montague is threatening to bring suit for breach of promise and damage to his daughter's reputation. He wants compensation amounting to £50,000 and a public apology printed in every newspaper in London." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, and she set down her teacup before it could slip from her suddenly nerveless fingers, her worst fears crystallizing into the reality she had dreaded since the moment Frederick had spoken those words at the altar and shattered the careful architecture of duty and expectation that society had constructed around them both. "I should go," she said, rising to her feet, on legs that felt uncertain beneath her. "I should disappear into the country where no one will find me, and you can say that I bewitched you somehow, that you were temporarily mad, that you came to your senses and realized your mistake." Frederick crossed the room in 3 long strides and caught her hands in his dark eyes blazing with an intensity that stopped her words in her throat. "I will not hear such nonsense," he said, his voice low and fierce. "I have spent 6 months without you believing I had lost you forever, and I will not spend another day, another hour, another moment pretending that my life has any meaning without you in it. So let Montague threaten, and let society whisper, and let the newspapers print whatever scandal they wish, because none of it matters. None of it has ever mattered. The only thing that matters is standing before me offering to sacrifice herself for my reputation when I would burn my reputation to ash to keep her beside me." The firelight cast dancing shadows across the walls of the drawing-room as Frederick released Eleanor's hands only to lower himself to one knee before her, and the sight of the Duke of Ravenscroft kneeling on his own carpet in his own home, with rain still dampening his dark hair and his eyes blazing with a certainty that seemed to illuminate the very air between them, stole the breath from Eleanor's lungs as completely as if she had been plunged back into the storm outside. Thomas stood near the doorway, a silent witness whose presence Eleanor had nearly forgotten, and she saw him press his hand briefly over his heart as Frederick reached into his coat pocket and withdrew not the elaborate ring that had been meant for Lydia's finger, but something far simpler, a slender band of gold set with a single sapphire that caught the firelight and scattered it into fragments of blue flame. "This was my grandmother's ring," Frederick said, his voice steady, despite the emotion that roughened its edges. "She gave it to my grandfather when she accepted his proposal against her family's wishes, when she chose love over the match her parents had arranged, when she proved that the Sinclair legacy was built not on fortune or connections but on the courage to follow one's heart regardless of consequence." Eleanor felt tears threatening again, felt the weight of history and hope pressing against her chest as Frederick continued speaking, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "I knew at Pemberton that you were the woman I wanted to spend my life with," he said. "I knew it in the library when you laughed at my poor attempt at wit and challenged my interpretation of Shakespeare and looked at me as though I were simply a man rather than a title to be pursued. I knew it when I picked that rose for you and watched you press it to your lips and tuck it away as though it were treasure rather than a common garden flower. I knew it, and I was a coward who let duty and debt convince me that knowing was not enough." His voice broke slightly on the last words, and Eleanor found herself reaching out to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw as he leaned into her palm with a sigh that seemed to release years of tension. "I am asking you now, Eleanor Ashworth, not as a duke seeking a duchess, but as a man who has been only half alive since the moment he lost you. Will you marry me and make me whole again? Will you wear this ring that represents love chosen freely over obligation accepted grimly? Will you stand beside me and let the world say what it will, because none of their whispers could ever matter more than the sound of your voice saying yes?" Eleanor sank to her knees before him, heedless of the borrowed grey dress pooling around her, and took his face in both hands as she had dreamed of doing through countless sleepless nights. "Yes," she breathed, "to everything. Yes, to you. Yes, to scandal and consequence and whatever storms may come, because I have loved you for 2 years, and I will love you for 20 more, and 20 beyond that, until time itself forgets to count." Frederick slipped the sapphire ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms. And from the doorway, Thomas cleared his throat past obvious emotion and murmured that he would see about champagne, while the newly betrothed couple held each other before the fire and let the future begin. The champagne arrived in Thomas's capable hands, along with the news that the household staff had unanimously declared their loyalty to their master and his chosen bride. And as the golden bubbles rose in crystal flutes that caught the firelight like captured stars, Eleanor found herself laughing for what felt like the first time in months, perhaps years, the sound strange and wonderful in her own ears as Frederick pulled her close against his side on the settee and pressed his lips to her temple with a tenderness that made her heart ache in the most exquisite way. "To the future Duchess of Ravenscroft," Thomas declared, raising his glass with a flourish that seemed designed to dispel any lingering shadows of doubt or fear, "and to the scandal that will make this season the most memorable in a generation, may your enemies choke on their gossip and your friends multiply like rabbits in spring." Eleanor blushed at the toast, but raised her own glass, the sapphire on her finger winking blue fire as she moved, and she marveled at how the weight of it felt not like a burden, but like an anchor, something solid and real that proved the morning's impossible events had truly occurred, and were not simply the fever dream of a woman who had worn black to mourn a love she believed lost forever. Frederick's arm tightened around her waist as they drank. And when Thomas excused himself to begin the delicate work of managing the crisis and rallying what allies remained to them, they were left alone in the golden light with the rain still pattering against the windows and the fire crackling its steady reassurance that warmth existed even in the midst of storms. "I should be terrified," Eleanor admitted, turning in Frederick's arms to face him fully. "Your mother will never accept me. Society will shun us. And I have brought nothing to this union but scandal and a borrowed dress, and 2 years of loving you in silence, while believing you thought me beneath your notice." Frederick cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the delicate bones of her cheeks, as though memorizing the architecture of her features for some future moment when he might need to recall them in perfect detail. "You have brought me everything," he said simply. "You have brought me back to myself, back to the man I was before duty and debt convinced me that happiness was a luxury I could not afford. You have brought me the courage to choose love over obligation, and I will spend the rest of my life proving worthy of that gift." The kiss that followed was deeper than their first, carrying within it all the promises they had made and all the challenges they would face together. And when they finally drew apart, Eleanor rested her forehead against his and breathed in the scent of him, rain and wood smoke, and something uniquely Frederick that she had carried in her memory through all the lonely months of separation. "Tomorrow the battle begins," she whispered, "but tonight we have this, and this is enough. This is more than enough. This is everything." Frederick smiled against her lips and pulled her closer still, and outside the rain began finally to ease, as if even the heavens had decided that enough tears had been shed for one remarkable day. The days that followed existed in a strange suspension between dream and reality, between the intimate warmth of their newly declared love and the external tempest of scandal that raged through London's drawing rooms and gossip sheets with the ferocity of the summer storms that continued to sweep across the city. Frederick proved as good as his word, installing Eleanor in a suite of rooms at Sinclair House that had belonged to his grandmother, and surrounding her with servants whose loyalty to their master far outweighed any concern for society's opinion. And when the Dowager Duchess arrived on the second morning with fury blazing in her eyes and condemnation ready on her tongue, Frederick met her in the entrance hall and informed her with quiet steel that Miss Ashworth would soon be the Duchess of Ravenscroft, and any member of the family who could not treat her with the respect that position demanded was welcome to remove themselves from his homes and his life permanently. Eleanor had watched from the top of the stairs, her heart pounding beneath the borrowed dress she wore, and she had seen the moment when the dowager's rigid certainty fractured against the immovable wall of her son's determination, had seen the older woman's mouth open and close without words before she turned and departed without the confrontation she had clearly anticipated. And in that moment, Eleanor understood that Frederick's love was not merely sentiment, but action, not merely words whispered in firelight, but a shield he would hold between her and any force that sought to diminish her. The wedding was arranged for precisely 3 weeks hence. Scandalously swift by society's standards, but Frederick refused to wait longer, refused to give the gossips time to poison what they had found, and Eleanor discovered that being the betrothed of a duke opened doors that had been firmly closed to a poor relation in a faded gown. Modistes arrived with fabrics and sketches, jewelers presented trays of glittering treasures, and invitations began to trickle in from those bold enough or calculating enough to align themselves with what was clearly an unstoppable match regardless of its unconventional origins. Thomas became a near constant presence, his wit and warmth a buffer against the more vicious whispers, and he confided to Eleanor one afternoon that he had never seen Frederick so alive, so present, so entirely himself as he had been since the day he walked away from the altar and toward the woman in black. The Montague family's threats of legal action quietly dissolved when Frederick's solicitors made clear that no breach of promise existed where no vows had been exchanged, and Lydia herself departed for the continent with her mother, seeking refuge from the scandal in Italian sunshine and the short memories of foreign society. Eleanor wrote to her aunt once, a brief note of thanks for the years of shelter, however grudging, and received no reply. A silence that hurt less than she had expected, because the family she was gaining proved infinitely more precious than the family she was losing. The wedding gown arrived on the morning of July 6, 1814, carried into Sinclair House by 4 attendants who bore the creation of ivory silk and delicate Brussels lace as though it were a sacred relic rather than merely a dress, and Eleanor stood in the center of her chambers, while the modiste and her assistants fussed and pinned and adjusted until the fabric fell in perfect waves from her waist to pool upon the floor like cream poured from a pitcher. She barely recognized the woman who gazed back at her from the full-length mirror, this creature of elegance and grace whose eyes held not the resigned acceptance of a poor relation, but the luminous joy of a woman loved. And when Frederick appeared in the doorway, despite all propriety and tradition forbidding him to see his bride before the ceremony, she did not scold him, but simply turned to let him witness what his love had wrought. "You are magnificent," he breathed, crossing the room in 3 long strides to take her hands in his, scandalizing the modiste, who fluttered protests about bad luck and improper behavior that neither of them heeded. And Eleanor laughed, as she had learned to laugh again in these miraculous weeks, freely and without the weight of sorrow pressing upon her chest. The ceremony itself took place not in a grand cathedral, but in the intimate chapel at Ravenscroft Park, Frederick's country estate where they had retreated from London's vicious whispers, and the guest list numbered merely 30 souls rather than 400, each one present because they genuinely wished happiness for the couple rather than because society demanded their attendance. Thomas stood as best man once more, his eyes suspiciously bright as Frederick spoke his vows in a voice that never wavered, and Eleanor found herself weeping openly when she promised to love and cherish and honor this man who had upended the world for her sake. The Dowager Duchess sat in the front pew with an expression that had softened over the weeks from outright hostility to grudging acceptance, and finally to something approaching genuine warmth, her resistance crumbling gradually in the face of her son's obvious happiness and Eleanor's quiet determination to win her respect through patience and grace rather than confrontation. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Frederick kissed her with tender reverence before their small assembly of witnesses, Eleanor felt the last remnants of her old life fall away, like the black silk dress she had worn to mourn a love she thought lost, replaced now by ivory and lace and the golden band upon her finger that proclaimed her the Duchess of Ravenscroft. The wedding breakfast that followed rang with laughter and genuine celebration, and when Frederick led her out to the terrace as evening fell and the first stars emerged above the ancient oaks of Ravenscroft, Eleanor leaned into his embrace and marveled at the strange alchemy of fate that had transformed a day of intended mourning into the beginning of her greatest joy. The months that followed their wedding unfolded like the pages of a book Eleanor had never dared to imagine herself inhabiting, each day bringing new discoveries about the man she had married and the life they were building together within the ancient walls of Ravenscroft Park, where summer ripened into autumn and autumn surrendered to the first frosts of winter. Frederick proved to be a husband of extraordinary tenderness, attuned to her moods and desires in ways that continually surprised her, and she found herself blossoming under his attention like a flower too long kept in shadow. finally turning its face toward the sun. The estate itself became her project and her joy, its tenants warming to the new Duchess, who walked among their cottages without pretension and remembered the names of their children, who established a school for the village girls and expanded the lending library that Frederick's grandmother had begun decades before. The Dowager Duchess visited at Michaelmas and departed at Christmas, having transformed from reluctant acceptance to genuine affection, won over by Eleanor's quiet competence and the undeniable happiness that radiated from her son whenever his wife entered a room. Thomas remained their most frequent guest, his easy humor and loyal friendship, a constant thread connecting their new life to the tumultuous day that had begun it all, and he delighted in reminding them at every opportunity that he had known from the moment he saw Frederick's face at the altar that the wedding would not proceed as planned. The scandal, as all scandals eventually do, faded from the bright flame of immediate outrage to the dim ember of old gossip, replaced by fresher outrages and newer indiscretions that captured society's fickle attention, and by the time spring returned to paint the Ravenscroft gardens in daffodils and bluebells, the Duke and Duchess were received everywhere with the deference their positions demanded and the genuine warmth their evident happiness inspired. Eleanor kept the black silk dress, folded carefully in tissue paper at the bottom of her wardrobe, not as a reminder of pain, but as a testament to the courage it had taken to attend that wedding, to bear witness to her own heartbreak, to stand in silent mourning for a love she had believed lost forever. The locket still hung around her neck, the pressed yellow rose within it now joined by a single perfect petal from her wedding bouquet, and sometimes in the quiet hours of evening when Frederick read aloud to her by the fire, she would touch it and marvel at the strange and winding path that had led her from a cramped room in her aunt's house to this place of warmth and belonging and love. She had learned, in those months of transformation, that the heart's capacity for hope could survive even the most determined attempts to extinguish it, that love declared too late was still love declared, that the courage to appear in black at a wedding could somehow lead to standing in ivory at her own.